Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and today, yet again, I'd like to talk about what I think are the worst cards in Arkham Horror the card game. In this list, I don't mean cards that are bad for the game, or cards that I personally don't like, but just plain old aren't effective additions to your deck. This is definitely the case when looking at the whole card pool. There are over 1,000 cards, and while it's fun to explore all of them to try out new combinations and synergies, for me, these have just never made the cut. Some of the weakest cards in the game have been fixed with the taboo list to some extent, so I'm not considering those on this list either. A few months ago, I made this list for level 0 cards, and today it's time to tackle the cards that cost you some experience to add into your deck. I'll briefly review the criteria I used last time for what I consider to be a bad card. First, its niche isn't well supported in the game. This pretty much means that the card is trying to solve a problem that really isn't too common or difficult to solve by other means. Some of the early design cards fall into this trap, as you'll see, and it's no fault of the designers for moving the game in different directions. Next, I consider whether or not the card actually does what it wants to do well at all. While I don't take off points for cards being useful only sometimes, I do fault the card for being bad at its niche. And finally, my third criterion is about the card's cost, which I define as the resource cost, the deck slot, and its XP cost. So point number 3 is even more relevant for this list because I think that spending XP, even any amount, is a huge ask. It's not that XP is scarce. It's not. It's the opportunity cost of what else you could be doing with that XP. Level 0 cards, on the other hand, ask nothing of you to include them in your deck. Sure, they could have been a different, better card, but replacing them is easy and even expected. How often do you replace a card that you've already sunk XP into? You might do it, but it sure feels bad. And of course, the greater the XP cost, the more I expect out of the card. But that said, if I'm putting level 1 cards into my deck, I do want them to be worth their deck slot until the end of the campaign too. So, let's get into it. I've chosen just one card from each class, and one neutral card. If I were just picking the worst 5 cards regardless of class, you might get a different list, but these are my rules, and I'm sticking with them. First up is level 5 Monster Slayer. 5 XP for a one-time chance to defeat a non-elite enemy regardless of health, and no bonus to that fight test either. So if you fail, well, sorry. To be fair, if you do pass, it's pretty great as long as you're saving it up for a very big non-elite enemy. The thing is, it was designed for the conglomeration of spheres in Dunwich, and we really haven't seen anything quite like it since. Yes, I know there is usually a 4 or 5 health VP enemy hiding in most scenarios, but typically those can show up as soon as the first scenario, and if you have access to this card, you have plenty of good ways to defeat those enemies at just level 0. Funnily enough, there is a level 0 version of this card that basically does most of the work with Nathaniel Cho that the level 5 card does, which, by the way, does not synergize with Nathaniel's ability at all. I know that there's a lot of level 5 Guardian cards that people are skeptical of, but to me, this one is just the worst. I'd like to see it tabooed down to about 3 XP. Well, there are just not that many Awful Seeker cards. I don't think Expose Weakness does much. I like the idea, and it was revisited in the level 3 version, but let's just talk about how weird this card is. You're testing intellect against an enemy's fight value to make one test easier for whoever fights it next. That's already not very interesting outside of, I don't know, a shotgun deck, but you're only lowering the fight value by how much you succeeded by. So, let's say an enemy had a fight of 4, and you wanted to get it down to 2. If the token you drew on the test was a -2, you'd need to get your intellect up to 8 to accomplish your goal. You know it could basically do the exact same thing? Tossing an unexpected courage at the test for your fighter. This way you only have to take one test altogether. Or, even better, your fighter can do the same thing for their own test. Even if you're trying to do the shotgun thing, overcommitting accomplishes the same goal. Now, maybe there's a world in which you're trying to reduce the difficulty down to 0 to easily pass, or play Exploit Weakness, but I've not seen that be quite worth it yet. Here's a rare recent card, Clean Sneak. It's a level 4 card, so we can sit and complain about Finn and Rita not being able to take it, but let's just focus on the card text for now. How is this worth it? If there's only one exhausted enemy, this is an okay level 1 card. If there's two, you can't even double up on what you're choosing, so you'd better want something in all the options. Is dealing 2 damage fast all that good? I feel like that's the bare minimum I want from Dirty Fighting, and I get that every turn. Okay, 3 and 4 exhausted enemies starts to look a lot better, but how often do you get that many exhausted enemies at the same location? I love evading, and I really do not see myself playing this card when there's so many better things in Rogue that cost XP. Moving on to Mystic, here is Book of Shadows level 1. Don't confuse it for Book of Shadows level 4 from the core set. That card is slightly more playable. This one is extremely confusing. You need to spend 4 resources before you can do anything at all. And then it's just extremely slow. Spending an action and a resource to add just one charge to a spell basically takes away the tempo that you get from the efficiency of spell assets in the first place. Now, the one exception is exactly Daisy Walker and Archaic Glyph's Guiding Stones, and that is very cool, but we're looking at an already very strong investigator abusing an overpowered card. If the only reason we might consider this card is one interaction, then there is definitely something wrong with the card in the first place. Here is another card from the Path to Carcosa, Infighting. Have you played this one? It looks like a fun upgrade to Dodge, except it only works in the enemy phase, and you can't cancel attacks by elite enemies, which tend to be the ones that hit the hardest, and you can't save your friends either. Why is this worth 3 XP? I can't remember a time when I got attacked by more than 2 non-elite enemies in the same enemy phase. Usually I want to take attacks opportunity if I'm engaged with multiple enemies, and this is in Survivor, which can usually tank these sorts of attacks. Can you engineer something interesting with Daniela? Probably, but why? You can also engineer some fun things with her without needing to play this card or spend much XP at all. The icons here are also baffling. Last up, we'll pick something from the neutral cards. I actually think the neutral cards are all pretty solid. They're all going to be overcosted because that's how balancing neutral cards works, but this card is just bizarre. I get that most of the fan design cards are a bit rough, but this one seems way too difficult to get enough value out of. How expensive should those cards be that you get to play at no cost if you're already spending several actions trying to get the box open? Maybe everyone is running agency backup. I don't know, I think the timing on this card is just awkward. You don't really want to waste time on this card, and most of the time, by the time you see it, you're not going to get enough out of the effect. Maybe if this were a story card that didn't cost you any deck space or XP? Maybe if Mandy Thompson's on the team? I'm just skeptical that this solves any problems you couldn't have fixed by just putting in a different card in your deck. But I admit it, the idea does sound fun. Alright, that is it for this list. What are some awful cards at level 1 plus that you've put into your deck? And have you had to drop any XP card into a campaign before? Let me know down in the comments.